My husband is pathetic and financially useless. That was the title of the Reddit post my supervisor showed me during our quarterly budget meeting, completely unaware that he was about to destroy my marriage in real time. I sat there in the Denver Municipal Transit Authority conference room at exactly 10:15 on a Tuesday morning, surrounded by spreadsheets analyzing bus route efficiency and coffee-stained engineering reports, while Tom pulled up his phone with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered internet gold and announced to our team of 6 transit engineers that he wanted to show us the most entitled woman on the internet right now. The post had exploded overnight with over 12,000 upvotes and was trending in multiple relationship advice subreddits. And as Tom began reading the highlights aloud with increasing amusement, I felt my stomach drop with each familiar detail that hit like physical blows. The author complained bitterly about living in what she called a mediocre apartment in Denver with outdated fixtures and no mountain views, driving a basic and embarrassing 2021 Honda CR-V instead of something more stylish, and being married to a husband who refused to support her artistic dreams by funding expensive pottery classes and weekend creativity retreats. She described their financial situation as constantly tight and stressful, claiming her husband was too cheap and controlling to invest in her ceramic workshop that cost only $800 while they were supposedly saving every penny for a house down payment that would never materialize because he was too risk-averse to commit to anything meaningful. I recognized every single detail with growing horror because I had lived through the exact argument she was describing. It had happened in our kitchen just 3 nights earlier when Veronica had enthusiastically presented me with a glossy brochure for that exact ceramics-intensive weekend, the same one I had gently suggested we postpone until after we reached our house down payment goal of $25,000. The woman in the post painted herself as a creative soul trapped and suffocated by a penny-pinching husband who didn't understand that art required financial investment and emotional support, and she described their recent fight in vivid detail where he had completely dismissed and crushed her passions by coldly suggesting she use the pottery wheel and kiln we already owned in our spare bedroom instead of paying for professional instruction from real artists. What made my hands literally shake as I listened to Tom's dramatic reading was seeing the comments from thousands of strangers telling Veronica, because I now knew with absolute devastating certainty this was my wife of 4 years, that she deserved so much better than her loser husband, that she should seriously consider leaving her controlling and financially abusive partner, and that any real man with genuine love would prioritize his woman's happiness over hoarding money in some theoretical savings account. The top comment with over 3,000 upvotes bluntly told her to dump the dead weight and find someone who actually valued her dreams, while dozens of others shared similar stories about escaping relationships with cheap and unsupportive men who used money as a weapon of control. I maintained perfect professional composure through the remaining 45 minutes of our meeting, contributing normally to discussions about bus route optimization and infrastructure improvement timelines while internally processing the devastating fact that my private marriage was being publicly dissected by Reddit users across the country who were actively encouraging my wife to divorce me based on her completely distorted and manipulative version of our life together. When the meeting finally ended and Tom made another laughing comment about crazy entitled wives who think money grows on trees, I smiled politely and returned to my cramped cubicle in the engineering department, where I spent the next hour and a half reading every single comment on Veronica's viral post, watching thousands of strangers validate her victim narrative and paint me as an emotionally abusive monster while having absolutely no idea that the pathetic and financially useless husband they were collectively mocking had been quietly and lovingly funding the comfortable middle-class lifestyle she was now complaining about to the entire internet. The irony was absolutely crushing as I scrolled through comment after comment from people sharing their own stories about escaping relationships with financially controlling partners, with Veronica responding to dozens of them with crying emojis and messages about how she finally felt understood and validated after years of feeling trapped. She had crafted responses thanking people for opening her eyes to what she called financial abuse disguised as love, and she mentioned several times that she was seriously considering whether this relationship was worth saving or if she deserved someone who would actually invest in her future and happiness. The most gut-wrenching part was reading her describe the pottery wheel and kiln setup in our spare bedroom as basic equipment he bought me to keep me quiet, completely rewriting the history of how I had spent 2 months researching the best ceramic tools within our budget, driving to 3 different specialty stores to find exactly what she wanted, and then spending my entire weekend converting that room into her personal art studio because I genuinely wanted to support her creative interests. According to her version of events, I was a controlling cheapskate who threw her some basic supplies to avoid paying for real instruction, when the reality was that I had invested over $3,000 in her hobby while carefully budgeting to make sure we could still save for our future home. As I sat there staring at my computer screen, surrounded by the mundane sounds of office life and coworkers discussing lunch plans, I realized that my wife had just publicly humiliated me in front of 12,000 strangers and painted our entire marriage as a prison she needed to escape, all because I had suggested we wait 3 months before spending $800 on a pottery workshop we honestly couldn't afford without derailing our carefully planned financial goals. What Veronica's Reddit post conveniently omitted was the shocking financial reality of our relationship, numbers that would have completely destroyed her victim narrative if any of those 12,000 commenters had access to our actual bank statements and credit card bills. I earned $94,000 annually as a senior transit engineer, a respectable middle-class salary that I had worked 12 years to achieve through steady promotions, additional certifications in traffic management systems, and countless overtime hours analyzing route efficiency data, while Veronica made $48,000 as a veterinary assistant, a job she genuinely enjoyed but treated more like an expensive hobby than a career, frequently calling in sick for pottery workshops or spa days with friends. Despite earning nearly twice her income, I was covering $2,100 of our $2,500 monthly rent for our 1-bedroom apartment in a decent Denver neighborhood with mountain views that she now called mediocre, paying her $720 monthly student loan payments from her veterinary assistant certification program that she had somehow convinced me were our shared responsibility, since we were building a life together, and handling her $1,400 in monthly credit card bills that accumulated from constant purchases of premium art supplies, organic skincare products that cost more than my car insurance, boutique fitness classes she attended twice before losing interest, and frequent dinner dates with friends who somehow never seemed to pick up their own checks or reciprocate invitations to our place. Our supposedly basic and embarrassing 2021 Honda CR-V that she complained about in her post had been purchased entirely with my savings after 2 years of careful budgeting and extensive research into safety ratings and resale values, while her perfectly functional 2017 sedan sat unused in our assigned parking spot because she claimed it was too old and unreliable for her daily commute to the veterinary clinic exactly 15 minutes away, preferring instead to use my newer vehicle for her errands and social activities. The pottery wheel, professional-grade kiln, imported glazes, specialized tools, and complete studio setup that she described dismissively as basic equipment he bought me to keep me quiet had actually cost me over $3,000 spread across 6 months of birthdays, holidays, and random Tuesday surprises when I thought supporting her artistic interests would strengthen our relationship and bring us closer together. Savings that could have gone directly toward our house down payment fund but instead went toward facilitating her creative dreams because I believed in investing in her happiness. What made the financial imbalance even more infuriating was discovering that Veronica spent her entire $48,000 annual salary on personal indulgences without contributing a single dollar to our shared goals. $200 monthly organic skincare routines featuring imported serums and masks. $150 boutique fitness classes that she would attend enthusiastically for 3 weeks before moving on to the next trendy workout, artisan coffee subscriptions. That cost more than our internet and streaming services combined, frequent dinners at trendy restaurants with her pottery class friends who somehow never reciprocated invitations or offered to split group expenses, and impulsive online shopping sprees for designer clothes she would wear exactly once before declaring them not really my style anymore and relegating them to our overcrowded closet. She contributed absolutely nothing to our joint savings account, treating our shared financial goals like optional suggestions rather than firm commitments we had discussed extensively, while I meticulously tracked every expense in spreadsheets and transferred $500 each month toward our supposed future home that she claimed to want desperately but never actually helped fund beyond pointing out houses she liked on Zillow. After spending 30 minutes processing this devastating betrayal and watching even more strangers encourage my wife to leave her supposedly financially abusive husband, I created my first Reddit account in my life and crafted a detailed response that laid out our actual financial contributions with the mathematical precision of an engineering report, including exact percentages, detailed monthly breakdowns, and a calculation showing that I covered approximately 78% of our combined living expenses while somehow being portrayed as cheap and controlling for suggesting we postpone one $800 workshop. I posted my response with carefully redacted bank statement screenshots that protected our privacy while clearly demonstrating the payment patterns and financial flow, then immediately called my credit card company to remove Veronica as an authorized user on all 3 cards, effectively freezing her access to what she had apparently begun thinking of as unlimited funding for her lifestyle rather than shared financial resources we had explicitly agreed to use responsibly for necessities and planned purchases. The customer service representative seemed genuinely confused about why I wanted to remove my wife's access so urgently, especially when I mentioned it needed to be effective immediately, but I simply explained that we were restructuring our finances and needed separate accounts going forward, which was technically accurate even though the complete truth was that I absolutely refused to fund another single day of someone who thought so little of my contributions and sacrifices that she would mock me publicly to thousands of strangers while simultaneously draining my bank account. Within 20 minutes of posting my response, the Reddit thread had completely shifted as users began upvoting my detailed financial breakdown and questioning Veronica's original narrative, with dozens of comments pointing out the obvious discrepancy between someone claiming financial hardship while simultaneously having access to $3,000 worth of pottery equipment and a brand new vehicle. My post included a precise calculation showing that if Veronica simply paid her fair share of our rent and handled her own student loans and credit card debt, we would have an additional $1,800 monthly for our house fund, meaning that $800 pottery workshop could have been easily affordable if she contributed like an equal partner instead of treating me like her personal financial institution. The most satisfying part was watching the comment section turn against her entitlement as people realized she was essentially complaining about having a sugar daddy who expected her to occasionally consider their shared financial goals instead of treating his income as her unlimited discretionary spending fund, with several users sharing similar experiences of being taken advantage of by partners who weaponized therapy language about financial abuse to justify their own exploitative behavior. Veronica returned home from her Tuesday evening pottery class at exactly 8:43, and I could hear her fumbling with her keys in the hallway with unusual urgency before the door swung open with deliberate force, followed immediately by the sound of her purse hitting the hardwood floor and her frustrated voice calling my name with an edge of panic and anger that I had rarely heard in our 4 years together. She had clearly attempted to use one of my credit cards for her usual post-class dinner at that trendy bistro near the pottery studio and discovered that her authorized user access had been completely revoked, leaving her in the deeply humiliating position of having to ask her pottery instructor to spot her the $12 for a basic sandwich from the vending machine while she frantically tried to figure out why her reliable payment method had suddenly stopped working without any warning. I was sitting calmly on our familiar living room couch reading the latest issue of Transit Engineering Quarterly, a professional publication that Veronica had always mocked as the most boring thing ever written, when she stormed into the room with her face flushed red from both anger and the embarrassment of her recent public financial rejection, immediately demanding to know why I had deliberately sabotaged her Reddit post by responding with what she called private financial information that was supposed to stay between us, and why I had maliciously frozen her financial access without any discussion, warning, or consideration for how this would affect her daily life and social obligations. I looked up from my magazine with the same deliberate composure and measured tone I typically used for quarterly budget presentations to Denver City Council members, calmly explaining that since she had made the conscious decision to publicly describe me as pathetic and financially useless to over 12,000 complete strangers on the internet, I had logically decided to stop proving her point by continuing to fund her increasingly expensive lifestyle while she contributed absolutely nothing meaningful to our partnership except constant complaints, financial demands, and now devastating public humiliation that had probably been screenshot and shared across multiple social media platforms. Veronica immediately launched into her well-practiced repertoire of emotional manipulation tactics that I now recognized after years of experience, starting with theatrical tears about being unfairly embarrassed online in front of people who would judge her without knowing the real story of our relationship, quickly escalating to threats about calling her sister Cassandra for emotional support and potentially a place to stay if I continued being unreasonable and controlling, and finally, reaching desperate accusations of financial abuse for cutting off her access to credit cards that had always been technically mine and had never been legally joint accounts despite her obvious assumption that marriage automatically meant unlimited access to my income and credit lines without any reciprocal responsibilities or accountability. I remained completely unmoved and emotionally detached throughout her entire performance, which seemed to frustrate her more than any argument or counterattack would have, simply stating in the same calm professional voice that functional adults should be fully capable of paying their own bills with money they had actually earned themselves, and if she genuinely felt that basic expectations somehow constituted abuse, she was absolutely welcome to seek counseling or legal advice to help her understand the fundamental difference between healthy financial partnership and the exploitative relationship dynamic she had apparently grown comfortable with over our years together. The argument reached its dramatic peak when she stormed into our home office and discovered that I had methodically transferred my entire $18,000 house down payment contribution from our joint savings account to a completely separate account in my name only, leaving behind nothing but her modest $900 contribution that represented her total financial investment in our supposedly shared future after 4 years of marriage and countless conversations about building something meaningful together. She spent the next 2 hours in increasingly frantic activity, first attempting to delete her original Reddit post while simultaneously discovering that the internet had already preserved dozens of screenshots and that my detailed financial response had gained significantly more traction and support than her original complaint, with thousands of users now openly criticizing her sense of entitlement and supporting my position, effectively destroying the carefully constructed victim narrative she had spent hours crafting to garner sympathy and validation from strangers. When she finally realized that her public humiliation was permanent, irreversible, and had actually backfired to make her look worse rather than garnering the support she had expected, Veronica retreated to our bedroom where she spent the entire night furiously texting her friends and family members in desperate attempts to rally support for her version of events while simultaneously Googling phrases like "husband cutting off wife credit cards legal" and "financial abuse in marriage laws." Colorado, apparently hoping to find some legitimate legal basis for her claims that would justify her behavior and validate the anger she felt at being held accountable for her financial irresponsibility and public betrayal. I could hear her making increasingly frantic phone calls through the thin bedroom door, alternating between tearful conversations with her sister and heated discussions with friends who were apparently not providing the unconditional support she had expected, especially after some of them had already seen both her original post and my detailed financial response that painted a very different picture of our relationship dynamics than the one she had been sharing with them privately for months. Veronica's sister Cassandra called me at 7:30 the next morning while I was methodically preparing my usual breakfast of steel-cut oats and coffee, her voice initially carrying that protective older sister tone I had heard countless times when she defended Veronica's various questionable decisions over the years. She launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech about how I was being unnecessarily cruel and vindictive toward her younger sister, who was apparently devastated and humiliated by my public response and needed support rather than punishment during this difficult time in our marriage. I listened patiently for about 90 seconds before calmly interrupting to ask if she had actually read both Veronica's original post and my response, because I suspected she was operating on incomplete information provided by someone who had a clear motivation to present herself as the victim in this situation. When Cassandra admitted she had only heard Veronica's version of events, I politely suggested she might want to review the actual Reddit thread before continuing this conversation, and I offered to email her screenshots of our bank statements and credit card bills from the past 6 months if she wanted to understand the true financial dynamic of our relationship rather than relying on Veronica's creative interpretation. The phone went quiet for almost 10 seconds before Cassandra asked me to send her everything I had, and within 30 minutes of receiving my email with documented evidence of every payment, transfer, and expense, she called back with a completely different tone, apologizing for jumping to conclusions and expressing genuine shock at learning how drastically Veronica had been misrepresenting our financial situation to family members for months. Meanwhile, our mutual friends from various social circles began reaching out throughout the week after the Reddit thread had gained enough traction to be shared across multiple platforms, with most expressing complete surprise at learning Grant had been quietly subsidizing Veronica's expensive lifestyle while she publicly complained about their supposedly mediocre living situation. My cycling group friends, who had witnessed me pay for numerous group dinners and brewery visits while Veronica ordered premium cocktails and appetizers without ever reaching for her wallet, were particularly supportive and validated my decision to establish reasonable financial boundaries after years of what they now recognized as obvious exploitation. Veronica's pottery class friends, however, presented a more complex situation, as she had been strategically sharing her victim narrative with them for months, claiming I was controlling and unsupportive of her artistic dreams while conveniently omitting the fact that I had funded her entire studio setup and covered all her workshop fees without complaint. Her attempts to rally support by creating a group text message claiming I was financially controlling her backfired spectacularly when 3 different friends pointed out that her own Reddit post directly contradicted her abuse claims. And several people shared specific instances of watching me generously pay for group dinners at expensive restaurants while Veronica ordered the most expensive items on the menu and multiple rounds of craft cocktails without any apparent concern for the cost. The pottery studio owner, Marcus, even contacted me privately through Facebook to express his gratitude for funding Veronica's expensive workshop fees and kiln rental time, completely unaware that Veronica had been simultaneously claiming financial hardship to negotiate payment plans and extensions while using my credit cards to cover the actual costs. When I explained that Veronica had been using my money while telling him she was struggling financially, Marcus was genuinely appalled and mentioned that she had recently requested a scholarship for an advanced ceramics retreat that cost $1,500, supposedly because her husband refused to support her artistic development. By the end of the week, Veronica had lost 3 close friendships from her pottery group after they realized the extent of her deception and manipulation, and she had been removed from 2 group chats where members felt uncomfortable with her pattern of dishonesty about both her financial situation and her marriage, leaving her increasingly isolated and desperate for validation that was no longer forthcoming from her usual sources of support. The most devastating blow came when her closest friend Ashley, who had been her primary confidant and supporter throughout our relationship, sent her a lengthy text message explaining that she could no longer maintain their friendship after discovering how extensively Veronica had lied about our financial dynamic, particularly since Ashley had been contributing money to help Veronica with supposed emergencies that were apparently manufactured crises designed to generate sympathy and financial assistance. Ashley revealed that she had lent Veronica over $800 in the past year for various sob stories about unexpected expenses and my alleged financial control, money that she now realized had been completely unnecessary since I was already covering virtually all of Veronica's living costs and had never restricted her spending in any meaningful way. The social media fallout extended beyond her immediate friend circle as the Reddit thread continued to gain traction in relationship advice forums, divorce support groups, and even financial independence communities where users were sharing Veronica's post as an example of financial manipulation and entitlement in modern relationships, creating a permanent digital record of her behavior that would likely follow her for years to come. Several co-workers from the veterinary clinic where she worked began treating her differently after the story spread through their professional network, with some expressing surprise at learning that the woman who frequently complained about money problems and requested schedule changes for expensive workshops was actually married to someone who earned nearly 6 figures and covered most of her expenses, making her constant financial stress seem manufactured rather than genuine. Dr. Richardson, the senior veterinarian who supervised Veronica's department, Even pulled her aside for a private conversation about professional image and integrity after multiple staff members had seen the Reddit thread and questioned whether someone who would publicly humiliate their spouse for internet validation possessed the character traits necessary for working with vulnerable animals and concerned pet owners who trusted the clinic staff with their most precious companions. After 3 days of failed reconciliation attempts that involved Veronica's theatrical tears, desperate promises to do better in ways she couldn't specifically articulate, and increasingly frantic pledges to change her spending habits and contribute more to our household finances, I presented her with a formal roommate agreement that I had spent Tuesday evening drafting with the same methodical precision I applied to municipal transit budgets. The document clearly outlined a complete division of all expenses moving forward: $1,250 monthly rent responsibility for each of us, $75 in utilities costs split equally, completely separate grocery shopping and meal preparation responsibilities, and individual accountability for car insurance, maintenance costs, cell phone bills, and any other personal expenses that she had somehow convinced me to absorb over our 4 years together. Veronica signed the agreement with visible reluctance and barely concealed resentment when faced with the alternative of immediately moving out and finding her own apartment on her $48,000 veterinary assistant salary, but her financial struggles became apparent almost immediately when her first half of rent payment was due 2 weeks later and she discovered that her personal credit cards were maxed out at nearly $12,000, money she had apparently spent on premium art supplies, weekend yoga retreats, expensive skincare products, and frequent dining out, while consistently using my credit cards for what she considered basic necessities like groceries and household items. I reclaimed possession of the Honda CR-V since the vehicle was titled exclusively in my name and had been purchased entirely with my savings, and I promptly removed Veronica from my comprehensive auto insurance policy, forcing her to reactivate coverage on her 2017 sedan, which had been sitting unused in our parking spot for over 8 months and now required $240 monthly for insurance due to the lapsed coverage gap that had created a high-risk driver classification. The transition period revealed the shocking extent of Veronica's complete financial dependence on my income and credit as she struggled to adapt to paying her actual fair share of basic living costs without the financial cushion she had grown accustomed to having available for every whim and impulse purchase. She began spending $85 daily on rideshare services rather than drive her perfectly functional but allegedly embarrassing older sedan to her veterinary appointments and pottery classes, a decision that consumed over $500 weekly from her already strained budget, and she resorted to eating ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches for most meals in order to afford her weekly pottery class payments that she absolutely refused to cancel despite her obvious financial crisis. Within 10 days of implementing our new arrangement, Veronica was forced to borrow $600 from her sister Cassandra to cover basic expenses like groceries and gas. A humiliating experience that required her to admit the true extent of her financial irresponsibility to the same family member who had initially defended her against my supposed controlling behavior but had since become one of my strongest supporters after reviewing our actual financial documentation. I remained completely firm but professionally civil throughout this transition period, cooking my own meals with ingredients I purchased and stored separately, maintaining my normal exercise and social routines, and enjoying the unexpected peace of evenings without constant financial negotiations, guilt trips, or elaborate justifications for why I should fund whatever new workshop, retreat, or luxury item had caught Veronica's attention during her daily internet browsing sessions. When she attempted to manipulate me through strategic emotional outbursts, deliberate absences from our apartment, and passive-aggressive comments about my supposed coldness and lack of empathy, I responded by becoming even more efficient in my meal preparation and household management, developing a satisfying routine of weekly meal prep sessions that provided me with healthy, cost-effective meals while demonstrating that I was not only capable of thriving without her financial drain but actually preferred the independence and control over my own resources. Her desperation became increasingly obvious as she realized that her traditional manipulation tactics were completely ineffective against someone who had finally recognized the pattern of exploitation and refused to resume funding her lifestyle simply because she was struggling to adjust to the reality of paying her own bills like a functional adult. And her growing frustration with my emotional detachment only reinforced my conviction that ending this financial arrangement permanently was the healthiest decision I had ever made in our relationship. The most telling moment came during our third week under the new arrangement when Veronica attempted to guilt me into paying for groceries by dramatically opening our empty refrigerator and announcing that she was literally starving because she couldn't afford both food and her pottery class fees, apparently expecting me to choose feeding her over maintaining my reasonable boundaries about financial responsibility. I calmly pointed out that her $48,000 salary was more than sufficient to cover basic necessities if she prioritized essentials over luxury activities, and I suggested she might consider temporarily suspending her pottery classes until she developed a sustainable budget that balanced her artistic interests with fundamental survival needs. Her response was a furious rant about how I had changed and become heartless compared to the supportive partner I used to be, completely missing the irony that the only thing that had changed was my willingness to subsidize someone who publicly described me as pathetic while privately draining my financial resources. By the fourth week, Veronica's financial situation had deteriorated so dramatically that she was forced to ask Marcus, the pottery studio owner, for a payment plan on her upcoming advanced glazing workshop, citing unexpected financial difficulties without mentioning that these difficulties stemmed entirely from being required to pay her own rent and expenses like every other adult in America. Marcus, who now knew the truth about our financial dynamic, politely declined her request and suggested she might want to focus on mastering basic techniques with the expensive equipment her husband had already provided before investing in advanced instruction she clearly couldn't afford independently. The rejection was apparently devastating to her self-image as a serious artist who deserved investment and support, and she spent that entire evening crying while scrolling through social media posts of other women whose partners had surprised them with expensive gifts or elaborate vacations, torturing herself with comparisons to relationships where she imagined the financial dynamic was more favorable to the woman involved. What Veronica failed to understand was that I had never been opposed to supporting her dreams or investing in our shared future, but I had grown completely unwilling to fund someone who responded to my generosity with public humiliation and private contempt, treating my financial contributions as entitlements rather than gifts that deserved gratitude and respect. The shift in our household dynamic was remarkable as I discovered how much mental energy I had been unconsciously dedicating to tracking expenses, justifying purchases, and managing the constant anxiety of never knowing when the next financial demand would arrive. And I found genuine peace in the simplicity of being responsible only for my own choices and their consequences. After 6 weeks of mounting tension and increasingly desperate attempts to restore our previous financial arrangement through tears, anger, and elaborate promises of future change that never included specific actionable steps, Veronica finally scheduled couples counseling with a therapist she had specifically selected for specializing in what she called financial trauma recovery, clearly hoping for professional validation of her claims that I had been financially abusive and that her struggles represented legitimate psychological damage rather than the natural consequences of fiscal irresponsibility. I researched her chosen therapist extensively and discovered that Dr. Sarah Chen appeared to have a bias toward viewing male financial decision-making as inherently controlling, based on her published articles and workshop descriptions, so I politely but firmly insisted on Dr. Patricia Morrison instead, a neutral marriage counselor with extensive expertise in financial dynamics, communication patterns, and relationship power structures who had excellent reviews from both male and female clients. Seeking genuinely balanced perspective on marital conflicts. During our first and ultimately only joint session, Dr. Morrison methodically reviewed the documented evidence I had prepared, including bank statements, credit card bills, payment histories, screenshots of Veronica's Reddit post, and my detailed financial response. While Veronica sat increasingly uncomfortable as the therapist absorbed the full scope of our relationship's economic reality rather than simply accepting her victim narrative at face value. Dr. Morrison listened patiently to Veronica's carefully rehearsed explanation of how my financial control had damaged her self-esteem and artistic development, but then gently yet firmly pointed out that the financial arrangement she described as normal marriage support actually constituted clear financial exploitation of me rather than abuse of her, since I was covering nearly 80% of our living expenses while she contributed nothing to our shared goals and actively criticized my generosity in public forums designed to generate sympathy for her manufactured victimhood. The session took a dramatic turn when Dr. Morrison directly addressed Veronica's entitled attitude toward my income, explaining that healthy partnerships involved mutual contribution and shared responsibility rather than one person funding another's lifestyle while receiving public humiliation and private contempt in return. And she suggested that Veronica might benefit significantly from individual therapy focused on addressing what appeared to be deep-seated entitlement patterns and an inability to take accountability for her own choices and their consequences. Veronica became increasingly defensive throughout this feedback, interrupting Dr. Morrison multiple times to argue that the therapist didn't understand the emotional labor she provided or the sacrifice she made by staying in a relationship with someone who didn't appreciate her properly, and when Dr. Morrison asked for specific examples of these contributions, Veronica could only cite her physical attractiveness and the social status she believed she provided by being seen with me at public events. The session reached its breaking point when Dr. Morrison suggested that Veronica's public humiliation of our marriage represented a fundamental breach of trust that would require extensive individual work to address before couples counseling could be productive, and Veronica stormed out of the office declaring that the therapist was clearly biased and didn't understand modern relationships because she refused to validate the victim narrative that had worked so effectively on Reddit. Strangers who lacked access to actual facts. I remained for the full session and scheduled individual follow-up appointments that Veronica never attended, and Dr. Morrison's professional assessment confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, that our marriage had become fundamentally incompatible due to Veronica's unwillingness to function as an equal partner rather than a dependent who expected lifetime financial support in exchange for her mere presence. 3 weeks later, I consulted with divorce attorney Jennifer Walsh, a highly recommended family law specialist who reviewed our extensive financial documentation and explained that Colorado's equitable distribution laws would likely favor my position significantly due to my clearly documented contributions throughout our marriage and Veronica's demonstrated capacity for employment and self-support. The consultation was remarkably straightforward as Jennifer noted that Veronica's own Reddit post would serve as powerful evidence of her attitude toward our financial partnership, and the documented pattern of my contributions versus her expenditures created an ironclad case for protecting my assets and avoiding any spousal support obligations that she might attempt to pursue. When the divorce papers were served to Veronica at her veterinary clinic workplace, apparently interrupting her lunch break and creating a scene that her co-workers witnessed with obvious fascination, she immediately began making frantic phone calls demanding to know why I hadn't warned her about this drastic escalation, and alternately threatening legal action for abandonment while begging for reconciliation if I would just give her one more chance to prove she could change her priorities and contribute meaningfully to our partnership. I remained completely committed to ending our marriage after the profound realization that I felt overwhelming relief rather than sadness about our separation, and that the prospect of rebuilding my life without the constant financial drain and emotional manipulation actually excited me more than any attempt to salvage what had clearly become a fundamentally dysfunctional relationship built on exploitation rather than mutual respect and genuine partnership. Veronica moved back in with Cassandra temporarily after discovering that she couldn't afford Denver rent prices on her veterinary assistant salary alone, especially with her credit cards maxed out and her spending habits completely unchanged despite her dramatically reduced financial resources, while I easily maintained our shared apartment and immediately began saving over $2,800 monthly that had previously been consumed by her lifestyle expenses, student loans, and impulse purchases. The contrast was stark and liberating as I realized how much financial stress I had been carrying without fully recognizing its impact on my mental health and overall quality of life, and I began making plans for investments, travel, and personal goals that had been impossible while subsidizing someone else's expensive hobbies and unrealistic expectations about lifestyle maintenance without corresponding income or contribution. Veronica's desperation intensified as she realized that her traditional support network had largely abandoned her after the public revelation of her deceptive behavior, and her attempts to find new housing, rebuild her credit, and maintain her social activities without access to my income created a harsh education in financial reality that no amount of pottery classes or yoga retreats had prepared her for in any meaningful way. The divorce finalized after exactly 4 months of surprisingly minimal drama, largely because Veronica's attorney quickly recognized that her position was legally indefensible given the overwhelming documentation of our financial arrangement and her own public statements about our relationship that directly contradicted any claims of abuse or unfair treatment. The final settlement was remarkably straightforward. Veronica retained possession of her 2017 sedan and received $3,000 from what remained of our joint savings account after I had already withdrawn my house down payment contribution, while I kept the Honda CR-V that I had purchased entirely with my own savings, maintained full ownership of my retirement accounts and investment portfolio that she had never contributed to in any capacity, and retained all of our shared household items since Veronica had moved out completely and expressed no interest in splitting furniture, kitchen appliances, or electronics that she couldn't afford to move or maintain independently. Judge Martinez, a no-nonsense family court veteran who had clearly encountered similar cases before, denied Veronica's desperate last-minute request for spousal support after reviewing the extensive evidence of my disproportionate financial contributions throughout our marriage, noting specifically that Veronica had maintained full employment and complete spending autonomy during our relationship while choosing to allocate her entire income to personal luxuries rather than contributing to shared household expenses or savings goals. The judge's written decision included pointed language about the importance of financial partnership in marriage and the distinction between temporary support during genuine hardship versus permanent subsidization of someone capable of self-sufficiency who simply preferred to be financially dependent, effectively creating legal precedent that validated every boundary I had established during our final months together. Veronica deleted all of her social media accounts within weeks of the divorce being finalized, apparently unable to escape her internet infamy as the Reddit story continued circulating in relationship advice forums, divorce support groups, and financial independence communities where users regularly shared her original post as a cautionary tale about entitlement and manipulation in modern relationships, creating a permanent digital legacy that would likely follow her into future dating, relationships, and social situations. I thrived immediately in my newfound financial freedom, using the money I had previously spent on her lifestyle to purchase professional-grade cycling equipment that enhanced my weekend rides through the Colorado mountains, completely renovating our former shared apartment into a sleek modern bachelor pad with high-end kitchen appliances and a home office setup that reflected my personal taste rather than our previous compromises, and taking a spectacular solo photography trip to Iceland that Veronica had previously dismissed as too expensive and pointless during our discussions about travel priorities and budget allocation. The contrast between my post-divorce contentment and her obvious struggles was stark and satisfying as I focused on building genuine wealth through increased retirement contributions and strategic investments while she apparently bounced between temporary housing situations and struggled to rebuild her credit after years of fiscal irresponsibility that had been masked by my financial support and generosity. 2 years after our divorce was finalized, I met Elena Rodriguez, a 32-year-old urban planning consultant who worked for the same municipal government system I did, through my cycling club during a weekend group ride through the foothills outside Denver, and our relationship developed naturally around shared financial values, mutual respect for each other's professional independence, and a genuine appreciation for each other's company that felt completely different from the transactional dynamic I had grown accustomed to with Veronica. Elena insisted on splitting every dinner check from our very first date, contributed equally to planning and funding our weekend trips, and showed genuine interest in my transit engineering work while sharing fascinating insights about city development and infrastructure planning that enhanced my own understanding of municipal systems and urban growth patterns. When we moved in together after 8 months of dating, Elena contributed her full share of rent, utilities, and household expenses without any negotiation or discussion because she considered equal financial partnership to be a basic requirement of adult relationships rather than an optional gesture of goodwill, and she actually earned slightly more than I did in her consulting role, creating a dynamic of mutual support and shared prosperity that felt revolutionary compared to my previous experience of being treated like a human ATM. Our shared financial goals included saving for a house down payment that we both contributed to equally, planning international travel adventures that we researched and budgeted together, and building investment portfolios that reflected our individual risk tolerances while supporting our common vision of early retirement and financial independence that seemed achievable with two committed partners working toward the same objectives rather than one person carrying the full burden while the others spent frivolously. 3 years after my devastating discovery of Veronica's Reddit post, when Elena and I were literally touring wedding venues in the stunning countryside of Tuscany during a vacation we had planned and saved for together over 18 months, my phone buzzed with an Instagram message from an account I didn't initially recognize. But the profile picture and writing style quickly revealed itself to be Veronica attempting to reconnect under the pretense of having learned and grown from our divorce and wanting to clear the air about our past relationship, apparently unaware that I was in the process of planning a future with someone who actually deserved my generosity and partnership. The timing of her message was almost poetic in its irony as I stood in a centuries-old Tuscan villa with Elena, discussing catering options and flower arrangements for our wedding celebration while calculating how our combined savings and careful financial planning had made this dream destination wedding possible without creating any debt or financial stress. A stark contrast to the constant money anxiety I had experienced during my marriage to someone who treated my income as her personal discretionary fund. I showed Elena the message out of transparency and mild amusement rather than any emotional concern, and her reaction was a combination of laughter and genuine sympathy for someone who was apparently still struggling to understand why treating a partner like a financial resource might lead to permanent consequences and relationship failure. Elena's perspective on the situation was both practical and insightful as she pointed out that Veronica's attempt to reconnect 3 years later suggested she had probably exhausted other options for financial support and was testing whether I might be willing to resume my role as her safety net, possibly after discovering through mutual acquaintances or social media that my life had improved dramatically since our divorce while hers had apparently continued to decline. We decided together that the message didn't warrant a response since engaging with someone who had caused such significant damage to my financial and emotional well-being would serve no productive purpose, and I simply blocked the account while Elena and I returned to planning our wedding celebration with the confidence and joy that comes from building something meaningful with a true partner who shares both dreams and responsibilities equally. The contrast between my relationship with Veronica and my partnership with Elena couldn't have been more profound, and Veronica's pathetic attempt to re-enter my life only served to highlight how much genuine happiness and financial security I had gained by refusing to settle for someone who saw my worth purely in terms of what I could provide rather than who I was as a person, friend, and equal partner in building a shared future together.